Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Hunt. I'm the moderator of today's Wireless Communications Alliance event, where we're going to talk about Back to the Future and briefly talk about the history of the cell phone, as well as talk about where things are going from a personal communications perspective, from a network perspective, from a spectrum perspective, and where are these devices ultimately going? So I think it should be a great discussion. We have a fabulous group of panelists with us today. With us is Marty Cooper, chairman of Dyna LLC, and really the father of the mobile cell phone. Marty has the distinction of actually making the first portable cellular phone call in New York City in 1973. I want to say, I don't have this exact, but about 10 years before the cellular network became really a commercial solution. But Marty, I'm sure will correct me when we go through this. Also joining us is Mike Marcus. Mike has been working recently as the principal research scientist for the Institute of Wireless Internet of Things, but he has a long history in wireless, specifically at the FCC, and so he'll have some great insights as to past, present, and future opportunities. And we also have Rob Reagan with us today, managing member of Orca Ventures, but has been involved in lots of wireless initiatives, from spectrum to services to capabilities in the marketplace that exist and perhaps don't exist. And so I think we'll have a pretty interactive dialogue. One thing I'd like to tell the audience is that this is going to be interactive. We'd love questions from the audience. To ask a question in Zoom, you can simply go to the Q&A tab, click on Q&A, ask your questions. We'll be monitoring, and we'll try to fit all your questions in and ask our panelists. If it's for a specific panelist, please just let us know that. Otherwise, we'll just ask it to the group. And try not to use the chat. The Q&A is a much better area for us to monitor and manage. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. I want to set the stage because 1973 was a long time ago, right? We're talking 50 years ago. There weren't ICs. There was no internet, which meant we didn't have social media. We certainly didn't have Zoom. We didn't have digital cameras, right? And we certainly didn't have cameras and phones. We didn't have cordless phones. And we did have car phones, if you want to call it that. We had car phones that literally tethered you to your car, and in various iterations, you had about a 1 in 20 chance of that call actually going through. So it was really at the beginning of this venture that people started thinking about cellular telephony. And Marty came along at Motorola with a perspective that you were tethered for the first 100 years of phones to your home or to your office with a wire and something on the wall. Why, when we move things to mobility, would we want to be tethered to anything like a car? And so that was a unique perspective. And so, Marty, I'd like to start with you. You've seen a lot go on in the last half a century in telephony. What did we get right, and what didn't we get right?
Well, clearly we must have done the basic job right, because you covered it very well, Tom. We did persuade people that the way we were communicating back in 1973 using wired telephones was not the right way. The people didn't want to call a place, they wanted to call a person. And that is the one distinction between the wireless network and the old wired network. The one thing that people don't realize, that back in 1973, there was the possibility that cellular would never happen. because there was a battle between Motorola and AT&T. I shouldn't use the term AT&T. Motorola and the Bell system. This was the old AT&T. And each of these companies had a different vision of what the future would be. The Bell system didn't feel like portable telephones were technically possible and that the world was ready for them. They didn't think that the mobile market was very significant. And the FCC had a really difficult decision to make. Fortunately, they made the right one. And the consequence of their decision, specifically that the industry would decide whether we would have car phones or handheld portables. And the second is the FCC decided that there would not be a monopoly in the cell phone business. The result of that, we all know, is that there are more cell phones in the world today than there are people. There are more cell phones in the United States than there are people. Cell phones have become a fundamental part of our lives. So clearly the FCC did make the right decision. The remarkable thing about their decision is that today, as you point out, Tom, next year it's going to be the 50th anniversary of that first phone call in New York, that we are only at the beginning. And I think that's the essence of what this meeting is more on what the future is going to be rather than digging up the old history. But even though cellular telephony is 50 years old, even though our lives have all been changed by that, it's only the beginning. Cellular is on the cusp of revolutionizing education, revolutionizing healthcare. It has changed the way we collaborate, and that is only beginning. We're just learning after some 40 years, as you point out, of commercial service. We're just learning how to use our cell phones. We have what you might call crazy statements that the cell phone is adaptable to the person. Of course it is. All you have to do is get the right apps, right? The only trouble is there are 2 million apps available on the Apple phone or an Android phone, and all you have to do is select between those. Clearly, we've got a ways to go before the cell phone is as useful as it could be. But one way I know we will prevail. One of the problems that the FCC, in my judgment, and I hope we get into an argument about this, is the FCC decided the spectrum would be auctioned off. I believe that this was a mistake, that in fact, the opportunity for competition has been minimized. We've started out with a large number of carriers. We now have only 3 major carriers left, and the opportunity is for lots of different kinds of services. It's my judgment that we should have many more carriers and lots more competition. And the essence of that is a lack of understanding that we do not have a scarcity of spectrum. We have an abundance of spectrum, and that the carriers today are not using the most advanced technologies. We really don't need to move into millimeter waves this early. We don't. There is just lots of room for expansion of the existing spectrum. So
let me interrupt you there 1 second, Marty, because boy, you said a lot there. I'm going to jump over to Mike really quick. Mike, you spent a significant amount of time in and around the FCC. What do you think about the comment that Marty made relative to the auction process, et cetera? So I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Okay, thank you. when cellular started, first thing, when FCC adopted cellular rules in 1980, even though Marty had the handheld phones were not in mass production at that time, and the original rules for cellular were based on not handheld phones, but on lunchbox briefcases and car phones. So the original engineering, the original framework of cellular assumes non-handheld phones, and I must admit, I don't see data on when handheld phones went into production. Do you? What year? When did they actually get in large-scale production, Marty? Do you remember?
I'm sorry, say that again. When did
handheld phones get in large-scale production? Around 83, 84?
There were handheld phones in 1983. They weren't very good. They were huge and very expensive.
And they were scarce.
Didn't work as well as people would like, but they were in production. And if you want to talk about large scale, namely many millions, that took at least between 5 and 10 years.
Right. So the regulatory framework for cellular was based on much smaller sales than ultimately happened, and was based on lunch boxes, cars, and things like that. Indeed, in 1980, the first full year as FCC, the two big things at FCC were the final cellular rules and a proposal by the former ComSat to operate a direct broadcast satellite service with 12 analog channels. And at the time in 1980, they both looked like the next big thing. As it turns out, 5 years later, cellular was much bigger than anyone had ever anticipated in 1980.
And abundance. It sounds like Mike does not have enough spectrum bandwidth.
Marty, Marty, can you repeat that? Turn off your video for just a second. We were having a bandwidth problem, I think.
You think that, let me.
We can hear fine now.
It's my, oh, you could,
I didn't
thought
hear
it
what you
was
said,
Mike that was
Marty.
frozen.
Could
So
you
Marty,
repeat what you just said, Marty?
Your question, Marty, was back to Mike.
Mike, you cut out for a while. Could you remember what your last sentence was?
Well, I was commenting that in 1980, both cellular and the ComSat DBS proposal looked like the next big thing. And within 5 years, cellular was much, much more successful than anyone had possibly anticipated in 1980. And the ComSat DBS proposal was dead as a doornail. And it sort of shows how the crystal ball for these services does, for both the FCC and industry in general, didn't work very well, because basically both are consumer services. And when you give consumers a service they haven't seen before, it's hard to really know what consumers will really spend their dollars on. I mean, people say there were all sorts of people that said, of course, they'll buy cellular, and of course they'll buy ComSat DBS. But the reality is they not only bought cellular, they bought it much, much more than its proponents expected in 1980 as FCC was drafting the rules. So it shows the crystal ball. And I think one of the reasons why cellular was so successful, in 1980, people didn't fully anticipate the impact of Marty's handheld technology. And people were thinking about other things other than the handheld technology. So with the availability of as handheld technology became more common, cellular was much, much more effective. It had much more popular than anyone had possibly anticipated in 1980.
What does it say that here we are 42 years later and the market is still effectively controlled by spectrum scarcity? You asked about the auction thing. The early cellular licenses were not given out by auction. The early cellular licenses, one went to the local telephone company, and one was a competitive, mutually exclusive license between applicants. That system, without going into details, that system was a nightmare. Then they tried the auction was a solution to get out of that system. I agree with Marty, their cellular power is too concentrated in a handful of companies, but it isn't because of the auction in my mind. It's because AT&T, the FCC didn't have the guts to restrict mergers. At various times, FCC has put caps on spectrum and has ability to approve mergers. And I don't think it was a problem with the auction, but I will agree that FCC allowed, no matter how the license, remember, in the major cities, the licenses had nothing to do with auction. The 10 biggest cities in the country, it was handled through a different system, but FCC allowed people to merge and do things like that. And that's why we have this huge contract. And Sprint, for example, was allowed to merge with T-Mobile. You know, I'm not saying that was good or bad, but that type of mergers happen on multiple occasions. And that's why we have the consolidation of spectrum, which I agree is bad, but I don't think auctions are the devil in this case. And whether or not you like auctions, none of the alternatives, when you work out all the details, really work out any better.
Well, the point there, I think, to Rob's point, right? Here we have an interesting set of point of views that are conflicting, but I think it gets back to this point. Marty said at the open, there's an abundance of spectrum. And Rob correctly pointed out that while it's there, it's very difficult because that spectrum, based on the current system, only allows for the biggest players to participate. And, you know, in 1984, Judge Green broke up the bells, and here we are. We're back to 3 companies that control everything in the U.S. And so
It's even worse. It's even worse. Even though there's a Bell Labs nominally, in a sense, there's very little communications R&D other than Qualcomm. Qualcomm has a huge communication R&D, but the way it was implemented, I don't think it was intrinsic, but the way the breakup happens, Bell Labs only exists as a pale shadow of what it was originally. And if you go to Murray Hill, you'll find out most of those buildings are filled with accountants and salesmen and not with engineers.
You know, I want to stay on this topic just a little bit because it's interesting, because I think it will help us understand what's next. And I really want to get to what's next. But everyone's, you know, let's start at the handset. We've had several players get in the batter's box and control that batter's box for long periods of time, starting with Motorola, right? Motorola had great success in the early days of cellular, followed by, you know, other players, but then Nokia became the dominant player. You could say Ericsson was in the handset business, and they were outside the US for the most part. Then you started getting to the people in let's call it the first evolution of smartphone, right? Things in your phone that could help you. Starting with research in motion, and then handspring and Android, and then Palm's been in the batter box now. I mean, Apple's now been in the batter's box for 15 years with the iPhone. And I tend to agree with Marty that how smart is a phone when you have to go to a store and find your way through 2 million apps to figure out the thing you need to do what you want. And so first, how do we resolve that? You know, so let's talk about the handset. And from a personal perspective, Marty mentioned we're getting back. It's going to be pervasive in education and for students. It's going to be pervasive in healthcare. It's going to be pervasive in all these places. And yet, in 2022, we're still talking about coverage issues.
Yeah.
Right? We still don't have ubiquitous coverage. So let's talk through that a bit.
I was having a discussion the other day, and you know, this iPhone can do LiDAR, you know, 3D scanning. Yet, if I was, you know, if I was in the Mojave Desert and somehow lost my ability to connect to another Apple device on a low frequency that propagates better than the higher mid-band frequencies, just to, you know, connect to something, assuming there's no wireless infrastructure out there. I couldn't do it. So there, what we've prioritized seems to be, seems to have put us in a place where there's a lot of unfinished business, in my opinion, as far as what should be done or what needs to be done with the UE.
And so where would you start, Rob? Unfinished business. What, as you look at the unfinished business, where's your top priorities there?
Well, it's not making it half the thickness, right? So that no longer is the driver. I think it's consistently been about the display and the cameras and the size and weight of the phone, and battery life is obviously a great one to chase. But I would cover the basics. You said it, coverage. Being able to connect when you otherwise, you know, wouldn't be able to. So secondary means.
I could not agree with you more. I have trouble getting service in my living room, and I live in an urban area. The Internet of People really requires just two things: coverage and cost. And yet, my impression is that the emphasis of carriers is on super high speeds and low latency, and neither of which affects me as a person. I think the Internet of Things is very important, but I think we've lost the balance.
So Marty, you're thinking that the emphasis right now is more on the creating broader spectrum to move traditional compute and less about improving personal communication systems.
It's clear that their perspective is not in favor of serving everybody. My specific example of the one I'm passionate about is education. I don't think you can get an education today without having full-time access to the internet. Every kid ought to have that. And 20% of the kids in this country don't have coverage. It may be more than that. And at least another 20% can't afford the service because it's so expensive. So somehow or other, the FCC has to do something to this environment to change the balance of emphasis of the carriers. More competition would have done that. The FCC somehow or other should be urging the carriers to use spectrum efficient technology. Mike made the comment about not enough R&D. I think, Mike, that there is a lot of R&D out there, but the carriers have elected not to use some of these more advanced techniques like MIMO, like cloud computing. The reason they don't do that is because it makes the spectrum more efficient, and they don't have the opportunity to buy more spectrum and to increase their dominance in the industry. So what do you think of that suggestion?
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, it's clear that the major carriers don't have an incentive to serve rural areas or poor areas. And while as a pioneer of Wi-Fi, it's very gratifying to see school buses being used as Wi-Fi hotspots in poor neighborhoods, it's really disgusting that it has to be done in the first place. FCC did vote in the past week or two to spend more federal money on that, but the better question is, why isn't the communication industry doing this? Why is this federal subsidies of Wi-Fi is the carrier of last resort? Maybe the FCC shouldn't be giving carriers more spec. You know, maybe they should tell the major carriers, we have a whole bunch of requests from you for all sorts of different things. You're only going to get them once you increase the penetration in rural areas and in economically challenged areas. But the carriers are used to coming to FCC asking for all sorts of things, and FCC is busy queuing them up. I'm amused at the tweets I see now on 12 gigahertz for 5G. You know, maybe someone would say is no more bands for 5G until you get better 4G penetration, and particularly in rural America and in economically challenged areas. It's, you know, FCC's priorities seem to be,
Like,
they look at the inbox for major corporations, and anything that has a major corporation as a requester goes to the top of the priority, and the public interest, and particularly universal service, doesn't go to the top of the priority.
I think this,
and maybe
a
that,
lot of
that
this,
should be.
a lot of this falls into the, not the handset side of the equation, but the infrastructure side of things.
Yes.
You have things like LTE relay devices that have been in the standard for quite a while, yet they don't exist. And these are critical elements to be able to serve remote rural areas.
But just building infrastructure is, clearly you have to build infrastructure to serve rural areas. And if you don't make the investment in infrastructure, and the payoff for that infrastructure may not be as high as the payoff in yuppie suburbia.
Yeah.
But the point is, it has to be done, and maybe it needs federal subsidies in some way or other. But the top priority seems to be throwing band after band. You know, if you count up how many different times in the past 5 years FCC has made a new band available for 5G, it's absolutely amazing. And yet the societal issues of getting universal service to mean real broadband, as Marty said, you need some level of broadband for educating your kids these days, and that really should be universal, just as plain black telephones needed to be universal in the Depression. We had a universal service used to be a focus of FCC, and at the time it was plain black phones, and they've sort of expanded it beyond that, but they haven't been as aggressive with it as they were in the 30s with plain black phones.
Right.
And that's why rural areas and economically challenged communities don't really have the coverage they should have.
Well,
And
they're
as
at
we
least they're
said,
doing something in the realm of fixed wireless, but I think that I'd have to point at the at least the promise that I remember 20 years ago with when OBSI and CIPRI and these things were introduced to try to drive modularity and the efficiencies similar to what we've seen in the computing and the server market, right, in the base station realm, where you have a multitude of providers of more and more compelling subsystems that can contribute to the infrastructure and be gradually integrated into improving the front end, the baseband processing, all the various elements. And so I think that you know, from a perspective of someone who looks at new technologies that could and have been really, you know, impacting RF spectral efficiency and beamforming and many different areas, it's really a tough task to bring something to market, because you've got to go through run the gauntlet and run through the gate and maybe get purchased by a Nokia or an Ericsson to end up, you know, 5-10 years later in a base station. And I think that's just a broken system. Open RAN and that framework has, you know, promised a lot, and I hope it delivers, but it's, you know, I can't help but be skeptical given the you know, I've got a dozen technologies here that I've listed just off the top of my head that are, you know, significant improvements on anything that's deployed on the infrastructure sites today. Things like leveraging digital twin simulation modeling that's on the GIS level for better placement of antennas, which still isn't used by carriers today. There's people that are custom, you know, 3D printing antennas to maximize performance and take on more exotic, lower cost and more capable antennas. Like there's someone working with a Lundberg lens, if anyone knows what that is. There's great ceramic filters coming out of the UK. There's in the optical domain, they're processing very wide bandwidths and doing things like, you know, interference cancellation. That hasn't made its way into a lot of the infrastructure. There's great polar transmitters that are GAN that are highly efficient, that you know, are still working their way into the military segment to eventually end up in the commercial space. There's effectively lightning-proof silicon carbide transient voltage suppression solutions that will, you know, keep these sites up instead of having gas tubes, discharge tubes. There's metal MEMS out there for high power RF switching and phase shifting that haven't been integrated into the infrastructure. There's, you know, someone out there should be looking to shore up the GNSS problem we've got with all this infrastructure for timing and synchronization using LEO signals, which can be received indoors. You know, there are SDR capable, you know, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G in one framework that I think is helpful in certain parts of the world. In the digital domain, that would have to be, you know, the highlight for non-line of sight, you know, digital beamforming and baseband processing, the greater spatial reuse and sectorization. These are all technologies that are either stranded in an adjacent product because that's what they need to do to survive, or they've struggled to get capital and development capital and support to sustain themselves, to wait out effectively the market, which can only digest so much at a time because it's at the pace of, you know, whoever's running Ericsson and Nokia R&D. I mean, there's great companies that are smaller companies like Parallel but these guys don't have big R&D budgets. They don't have the dollars and the resources to be able to assimilate these great technologies that are, many of them end up dying on the vine over the years. But you know, I think there is something effectively wrong with the ecosystem that doesn't allow for a free market recognition of value because it's buried in a subsystem of a base station.
Rob,
How does that get resolved, Rob? What you think?
It's a market dynamic, and it's largely, you know, I think top down. It's, if you had more competition at the carrier level, you would have more people trying to adopt differentiated technologies that drive a better ROI, but you know, I realize it's tough because at the end of the day, you have people that look at this as a utility. And how many gas or water providers do you have at your home? You only have one, right? So if you look at this as a utility and you say that, hey, I only need one small cell there, or one or two for redundancy or resiliency, it's, you know, what is the business case for 3 or 4, you know, local infrastructure instances at every location? So it's.
Well, I think, but if it's a utility, it implies that it's everywhere, but it's not. I mean, you can go to the rural areas in this country and you can argue that the water may not be good, but they're getting water. They're getting electric, right? So, but they aren't getting cellular.
So
right?
yeah,
In some
when
cases,
you say water and electric, you're talking about, there's been very little innovation in those segments once it's thought of as a utility. I'm just saying a certain segment of the population really thinks of it as a utility. And this is a place where a tremendous amount of innovation is standing by waiting and yet to be done to really, you know, solve the first order job that should have been done years ago, in my opinion.
well, don't you think that the FCC has some responsibility in this area? Because the advertising that I see about 5 and 6G is that the United States has to be at the forefront of technology. And then I look at Japan, where they have a different system for allocating spectrum. They are now doing, Rob, I don't know if you're aware of this, rather than doing Open RAN, they're putting all of the processing up in the cloud. So all that sits in the cell sites is just the RF that's necessary for the cell site, but all of the processing, including the MIMO processing and all of the cellular, happens in the cloud. And there are 5 million subscribers in Japan. In India, somehow or other, they are providing service at $5 a month. You can't buy service in the US for $5 a month. and the coverage in other countries is greater. Somehow we have lost perspective on who the customer is. And I would hope that the FCC and the Congress, by the way, I think the FCC responds to the Congress with regard to auctions, and they're trying to raise money, and that distorts the distribution of spectrum in the public interest. What do you think, Mike?
Oh, you're muted.
Mike, you're muted.
Mike, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Auctions are the least worst solution. The alternatives to auctions are just as bad. But there are real problems, and I agree with them. The current carriers have the wrong incentive, but people exaggerate auctions as a source of the issue, and I don't think they are. I think that, as I said, allowing all the mergers that were allowed, and I think also the exit of America from the R&D business was a major factor. When Bell Labs melted down, all the carriers were saying, goody, we don't have to pay for R&D anymore. You were talking about the utility industry. In the electric industry, EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, is an industry-funded central R&D lab. In the cable industry, there's cable labs. The cellular industry and the wireline things, basically R&D has disappeared, except as part of a few manufacturers in the wireless industry. This country, namely Qualcomm, somewhat Nokia, and maybe the industry ought to be paying some money for R&D and not only being reliant on a handful of carriers of equipment developers that until 2 years ago were mainly in China. Now we don't buy from them, but you know, why isn't the industry paying for some R&D itself? And in the EPRI case, the industry, the money is matched by federal spending.
I agree 100% with what you're saying. I've tried to get the GSMA people excited about creating such an entity that's equivalent to a Cable Labs and really and try to get carriers on board. But unfortunately, this is not something that the carriers seem interested in. Someone's asked a question, which is exactly kind of my point about Open RAN because it really puts the mobile operator in the domain of being the system integrator. And that is, I mean, maybe somewhere in some boardroom, someone believes that creates a barrier to entry or a high degree of differentiation. And I'm sure, you know, someone's going to try to make that case, but there are so many great technologies that need to be showcased and supported economically to be able to you know, basically, so I agree with everything you're saying. I just think there is no appetite in the investment community for supporting this, because they've been so burned by you know, hard tech, frankly, and it takes so long to develop. I mean, I've been involved with so many 8, 10, 12-year overnight successes, and you know, most of them die before they find their little niche to survive, frankly, outside of that ecosystem. So you're seeing a lot of interesting technologies pop up in the fixed wireless ecosystem, because that's frankly where they need to go first, because getting integrated at both ends of the equation, on the UE side and the base station, if you need to be there to have your technology be leveraged, it's you know, that's a career opportunity.
But Rob,
So we have,
don't you think that?
go ahead, Mark.
Don't you
So
think?
let me point out in spending that FCC and NTIA are also underfunded. I know nobody wants to have sympathy for funding regulators, but the technical competence of FCC and NTIA has faded a lot in the past 2 decades. When I worked in OET, I was person number 157, and it isn't clear what the present staffing is, but I'm pretty sure it's around 70 people now. And
we got Wi-Fi jump-started with a $53,000 study to MITRE Corporation. FCC cannot afford to pay for independent outside studies, even though its British and Canadian counterparts can't. So the FCC is trying to juggle things, but in reality, the technical resources at FCC aren't what they should be. And nobody wants to go right there, Congressman, they spend more on federal regulation. But in this particular case, it's woefully incompetent. And I don't think the commissioners are getting objective advice from their staff because the staff just isn't being funded and not enough money is being spent on developing the staff to maintain their competence.
But don't you think that the basis of this whole thing, I want to go back to my comment about spectrum being abundant, that if that was true, that using all the modern technologies, there would be more spectrum than anybody could use, and I'm certain that that is true, that the FCC could go to the carriers and say, you do not need more spectrum.
The FCC doesn't have.
You should, well, let me finish, Mike. Yep. You should use modern technologies, and when you have used those technologies and you're using the spectrum you have, then you can come and ask for more. Now, I think the FCC has the authority to do that. I just don't think they have the will, Mike. I don't know if they have to spend more money.
No, I think the FCC is a very political organization.
They shouldn't be.
And look,
exactly.
You know, look at the current, not only the current commissioners, the commissioners for the past 20 years, and you will see that none of them has ever worked in the communications industry, except maybe as a lawyer at a very high level. But yeah. Nobody has, you know, nobody has really worked in the communication industry. And this same agency has jurisdiction on issues like how many TV stations Rupert Murdoch can own. That's a much more interesting thing for them. If you look at the questions that were asked FCC commissioners in their confirmation hearings, I can assure you that none of these questions ever came up, other than, do you want to give 5G more spectrum? They all said, yes, I want to give 5G every hertz is not nailed down. So there is, FCC is an agency that deals with both broadcasting issues and universal service fund issues. It's a lot more fun to give away hundreds of millions of dollars in universal service fund than to think about about whether carriers have enough spectrum. And the people who are FCC commissioners, and look at the staff who've worked for the FCC commissioners now and have worked for the past 10 or 20 years, the non-technical issues that they have to deal with are much more fun than these issues. And so when the carriers come in and who are multi-billion-dollar corporations and say, give us X, Y, Z, and have a lot of congressional support, nobody's going to pick a fight with them.
Right. Yeah. So if you got these people in a room and you ask them about system link budgets, you ask them about spectral efficiency, things that are critical to, they're managing a resource that is finite. Yet if they're going to assign spectrum to, let's say, I'm not picking on Wi-Fi, but Wi-Fi is horribly inefficient from a spectral standpoint. I mean, it's 1.5, 2 bits per second per hertz. LTE's 3, 4, 5, maybe in a best case scenario. But there's technologies out there that are 8, 10, or bits per second per hertz capable that are stuck in the fixed wireless domain. I mean, they're not any leverage of these things throughout the entire ecosystem should be the priority they have to make sure that the resources that are out there get used optimally. So spatial reuse should be an absolute mandate from a planning perspective in dense areas, and driving the best technology that and I'm not talking about the millimeter wave bands. I'm talking about sub 6, sub 12 gigahertz. Because there's all kinds of amazing innovations out there that take advantage of the multipath and make it not interference, but actually usable, leverageable signal. Yep. And it just hasn't been, there's no environment to, I guess, foster these things across the board.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more, Rob.
So we have a perspective here that I'd like to get everybody's input on, coming from an analyst and a WCA board member. He writes, it's easy to blame carriers, which I think deserve some of that, but you also have to look at their financial situation. Networks need huge investments, or if there are not many avenues for carriers to get good ROI on that. Other than broadcast, there are no good ways for them to monetize. All the value was taken away by the OTT folks. This is not sustainable. What do you guys think about that? What's the perception there?
But aren't we talking about the judgment of the carriers on what their priorities are? Because they're spending a huge amount of money on millimeter waves today. And I don't think anybody in the present market benefits from that. That maybe there's a future market, but what are they accomplishing with these millimeter wave systems? So the money that they're spending on that, they with the right kind of urging from the FCC or the Congress, they ought to be spending on improving coverage. Mostly in rural areas, but even in the city, the urban areas, the coverage is not as good as it ought to be everywhere.
I'm not sure that they understand the attenuation with millimeter wave, but I want to address what one of the comments you just said, or you just talked about, which I think is important. Yes, there is an over-the-top segment that is they haven't grabbed, all the money. They've innovated and they've been creative, and they've come up with basically applications with very high margins, and they've added value to their end customers' lives on both the device side of the equation and in the app store. And for someone who's sitting on a monopoly to sit back and whine and cry about, the fact that they're not getting they're a big enough slice of the pie is just, it's kind of absurd when you look at the degree to which they've frankly not opened up their networks. There's a world of innovation out there that they could tap into and leverage. And I'm not saying that they can be super competent at doing exactly what Apple does, but there's a world of innovation. And so if I had a solution right now and I wanted to get that very quickly onto Verizon and AT&T's network, it isn't that easy, right? So look at the resistance to adoption of the digital SIM, right? So digital SIM should have been eSIM should have been a no-brainer, a long time ago, and so having network choice and I think the carriers sit in an amazing vantage point. They have people on the UE side of the equation that are the best innovators in the world, people on the infrastructure and subsystem side of the equation, knocking on their doors all day long. What do they do?
I think, I think it gets to the point that they forget the mission, right? They lose track of the mission and chase the shiny object.
Yes.
Right now, one of the shiny objects for millimeter wave is this rush to the edge, and edge computing and edge devices that are going to be out there that need all sorts of capabilities. But I always like to say, if the post office knew they were really in the mail, if they were really in the information delivery space, all of our email addresses would be USPS.com, right? But they're not, because they forgot what their business was. And the carriers are stuck in that space too. They think more spectrum, more spectrum, more spectrum. There's an abundance of spectrum, and we can make money out of it by monopolizing and keeping everybody else out, right? And it's not helping with innovation. It's not helping drive newer technologies, and it's certainly not improving coverage, which is still, I'm sorry, in 1983, I had a Dynatac 8000, and it lasted 30 minutes on a charge, and it was horrible, but it was absolutely magnificent, right? I was untethered. And has it gotten better? Of course, but it's still, I don't have ubiquitous coverage. Other countries are having better luck with ubiquitous coverage and providing better services and better values, rather than just keeping the price artificially high and not really innovating for that price. In India, Marty mentioned it. You can get service for $5 or $10.
Right.
In Japan, you can get the same kind of thing. Here, you're looking at $60, $80, $100 a month, depending on the types of services you're getting. So how does the industry shake up this? It can't just be regulation. We can't just say, let's just go to the FCC. Granted, the FCC needs more strength and more weight in this process. But how do we get the carriers to help? How do they become part of the solution? Because until we deal with that, we have a problem, right?
Yeah, certainly if you were to start from scratch and if you could wipe all the legacy away, you would reimagine this from the ground up very differently. I mean, you'd have all the carriers sharing the same high, mid, or low rad center on the infrastructure. Instead, they're relegated to building another tower. The tower guys are doing great, by the way. What a great business to be in. Unfortunately, it's you can't say the same for the ecosystem that drives their utilization and the operators. Wall Street has not been kind, and I understand that dynamic, but I think it's almost monumental, the type of changes I think you'd have to make in order to fix this for the long term. But I think if they can just open up the gates to assimilating technologies that are frankly already here and already have a level of maturity to be integrated and adopted. We have RAN companies that are US RAN companies. I'm amazed that we have ignored and not supported them. I mean, if you look at the two European vendors that dominate this market, they've been around for quite a while, and the ball was in our court to really, when these Open RAN companies popped up, to really get behind one or two of them and make sure they're winners and successful in integrating the great technologies that are coming out of our universities and various corporations. But what I've seen more often than not is it's not Ericsson and Nokia that knock on the door of a lab where a great technology is being developed at a university that I'm visiting. It's Huawei, right? It was Huawei offering $5 million to support research in optical, in RF, front end, all kinds of different areas. So I hate. I mean, it's kind of one of these reap what we sow situations, but I think it is on the FCC and the government or some central body to pick up the R&D baton that's been left in a ditch somewhere, 15 years ago.
Tom, I wonder if I could, we're almost finished, divert the conversation to a more optimistic view.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that would be great.
Because I think that in the longer term, even though I agree with everything that Rob says short term, these new applications that are happening are really revolutionary. If you think if the education system finally does start moving over in that direction, and the appropriate pressures are, and the market gets big, if healthcare becomes highly dependent on it, that somehow or other the carriers will have to respond to that market. The FCC will have to respond. Those technologies will become absolutely essential, which they are not now with the spectrum policy. So I think the long-term view is still very positive, that the nature of what a cell phone is going to change. It's not going to be a monopoly kind of thing where everybody's got to take the same shape of device. I think the cell phone is going to become distributed on a person's body, and it'll be specific. It will contain artificial intelligence, so that will create an app for you or find one that suits you. So there are a lot of things that will change the market, and hopefully interrupt this a monopoly view we have, where we have only, at least in the US, 3 major carriers and only 2 suppliers. The solution to that problem, I'm not sure, Rob, is central. I would hope that the market's going to have an impact on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and I don't mean to cast a too negative of a picture here. I am optimistic that AR and VR will tremendously benefit education, and I frankly hope my own kids who are now in high school and college, I thought by default they're going to have these tools to learn with, yet it just it's so slow to adopt, and the things that end up being adopted are using AR for taking a picture of your face and turning it into a zebra head. I mean, it's I think it's the government's job to try to fast track and incentivize education to adopt the tools that frankly are already here in an Android or iOS device as well. But that's someone else's job. But I think that what's ahead of us as an opportunity is tremendous all the way around. But we've got to fulfill the coverage capacity promise first, and that should be done by adopting the technologies that are here and developing the ones that aren't quite here yet.
Well, let me interject, because I was going to interject just before Marty came in and said, let's talk about the future. We're running out of time. We didn't get to a lot of the things I'd hoped to get to, but that's okay, because I think the subjects we did speak on were important issues, and eliminating them will help, right? Illuminating some of these issues so that people are more aware of what causes some of these bottlenecks and why things don't get resolved. I think that's very important. But I agree with Marty. The future of personal communication systems, we're still in the beginning. We're still in the starting gates of this whole system. And so I'd like, just before we wrap up, to have each of you just kind of share where you think things are headed. Mike, we'll start with you.
Where are things headed? Well, the cellular industry is getting almost everything it asks for, is where it's getting. And do you see anyone in the FCC, either now or within the past decade, who asks the cellular industry hard questions?
No, I don't think they know what the questions are. Again,
well,
I think your point is.
I think they know. If they knew, the cellular industry is too powerful, and nobody. I don't think the cellular industry is evil, but everybody works a little better with someone looking over their shoulder, and the cellular industry doesn't want anyone looking over their shoulder, and they're politically powerful enough that they don't have they have a sense, like many other regulatory bodies, they've been captured by the cellular industry.
Rob?
Yeah.
Optimism for the future?
My optimism lies in hopefully what Open RAN will evolve into, and hopefully we'll end up with a renewed view of R&D. I think across the board, not just in the telecommunications space. We probably have a collective sense of regret that we stopped funding what really propelled us forward. And so I guess I'm optimistic that framework is going to open doors. I think it's going to initially happen as I'm seeing it currently evolving in developing markets. But when developing markets speed up with the integration of some of these capabilities, and maybe we'll take notice. But I think the applications are critical to the development of our society, and I think that there should be a direct tie into the Department of Education. I'm on the same page Marty is relative to the value of addressing how many people learn So I'm optimistic about how that environment's going to change. And then frankly, IoT has got to be one of the most exciting frontiers. I think the carriers have failed to be patient enough to understand that there are killer apps and there's nice to haves, and you really have to walk in the shoes of your customer, and the carriers don't have the time to do that. So there needs to be a middle layer of folks that can bring these IoT solutions to bear that you know, really will have a game-changing effect on you know, the next several decades in the both business and consumer environments.
Marty, the final words to you.
Well, I think that Mike and Rob have covered the issues very well. And we've been picking on the carriers, the suppliers to the carriers, and the FCC. I just want to add to that list the engineering community. I think that to a large extent, the engineering community has lost their way in the sense they get so wrapped up in the technology, they've forgotten about what the real objective is, because technology is the application of science to create products and services that make people's lives better. And without the people part, the technology is worthless. And so somehow or other, we need to get all of these constituencies that we're talking about here to recognize that, to adjust their priorities, to improve the lives of people. I think that's the purpose of the FCC's purpose, the Congress purpose, and somehow or other carriers have to jump on that bandwagon.
Well, I want to thank Mike, you, Rob, and Marty for sharing your thoughts and expertise in this area. The future is bright, but there are going to be bumps, and we're seeing the bumps of our innovation and some of the challenges of our previous decisions. But this market is going to be exciting. We didn't even get to talk about other subjects. You know, we just barely touched on the cloud. We mentioned Open RAN. We didn't talk about security and tracking and things like that I would have liked to have gotten to. So I think I'm going to grab this group again, and maybe we'll have a follow-on session. But I want to be respectful of people's time. I do appreciate everyone being with us today. I'm going to share a screen here. The WCA, you know, we're a nonprofit organization. We'd like to thank our sponsors for without them, we wouldn't be able to put on events that we do all the time. We make a living by getting donations to put these events on and have services and newsletters and capabilities, advisory services for our customers. So we appreciate that. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have another event coming. It's kind of a new event for us. We're going to go do the Sensor Converge Expo, Smart Sensors 2022. We talked a little bit about IoT. Sensors are becoming the next big thing. And while they're not necessarily personal and not relevant for our discussion today, they are key to the IoT. It's an event that we're going to do at the event live. We're going to be talking to some of the leaders in the industry, talking to the new technology providers, and we'll have live coverage at that event on June 28th. You can go to wca.org and register. Until then, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter for a minute. Peter, you guys haven't talked to yet, but we're gonna have a little raffle here and raffle off a couple of prizes. So, Peter, are you with me?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, thank you, Tom. First of all, Tom, thank you so much for organizing this great event, and thank you also to Rob, Michael, and Marty. We learned a lot again. We will learn again with our next events. Like Tom said, yeah, and now the raffle has started. We have raffled off two winners of two signed books of Marty Cooper's latest books, and the winners are Zvi Hirschhaut and Don Root. So I see that you're still here. Send us your coordinates, your addresses, so we can send you the book directly to your houses. So again, Svi, Hirschhaut, and Don Root, please send me your email or your addresses to peter.walter@wca.org. With this, I think we are all set. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you again on the panel and to Tom Hunt. Yeah, and looking forward to see you again in our next events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One final word, I forgot. So this was recorded, and the recordings will be available on our social medias within 48 hours. Yeah, thank you
Rob,
again.
check your chat because I put my email address there. I would love to get that list that you talked about.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you again, and see you soon. Bye-bye.